The moment I realized something was wrong at my wedding was not when I saw my brother near my drink, but when I took the first sip and felt the entire atmosphere of the room start to shift around me. My name is Emily Carter, and I still remember how perfect that morning was supposed to be before everything began to unravel in ways I could not explain in real time. The ceremony had taken place just an hour earlier in a beautifully decorated outdoor venue in Northern California, with white floral arrangements, soft music, and guests still smiling as if nothing in the world could possibly go wrong. He had changed into the reception portion of the evening feeling light, emotional, and overwhelmed in the way every bride is supposed to feel on a day like this. Everything looked exactly as it should have, from the long banquet tables to the soft lighting that made the entire space feel warm and safe. I remember holding my drink without thinking twice, because in a room full of family and friends, the idea of suspicion simply did not exist in my mind. That changed within minutes. It started as a subtle sensation, something I initially dismissed as nerves or exhaustion from the emotional weight of the day. But then it became harder to ignore, a growing sense of imbalance that I could not place logically. I set my drink down and tried to focus on conversations around me, but the feeling did not fade. Instead, it became more noticeable, as if my perception of the environment was no longer aligning correctly with my physical awareness. That was when I began to look around more carefully, trying to understand whether anyone else had noticed anything unusual. Most guests were still engaged in celebration, unaware of the shift I was experiencing internally. My attention then moved toward the area where drinks had been served, and that was the first time I noticed my brother, Daniel Carter, standing closer to the refreshment table than I remembered him being earlier. At first, I told myself it meant nothing. It was a wedding, and everyone was moving around freely. But something about the timing of his presence, combined with the way he avoided direct eye contact when I looked in his direction, made me pause longer than I normally would have. I did not accuse him of anything in my mind at that moment, but I did begin to register that my earlier assumption of complete safety in this environment might not be fully accurate. I picked up my drink again, holding it slightly differently this time, not drinking from it, but observing it as if distance alone could provide clarity. Around me, the reception continued as expected, laughter and music filling the space. But internally I was becoming increasingly aware that my experience of the moment was no longer matching the external reality everyone else seemed to be living in. I tried to dismiss the thought that had started forming in the back of my mind, because it felt too sudden and too serious for something that had begun only minutes earlier. However, the more I stayed in that state of observation, the more I realized that whatever was happening was not something I could simply ignore and return to later. I placed the drink down again, this time with intention, and focused on grounding myself in the environment, watching people, watching movement, and trying to determine whether what I was feeling was internal or influenced by something external. That was the moment I understood that the rest of the evening would not continue in the way it had been planned, because something within it had already changed, even if no one else had acknowledged it yet. At first I tried to convince myself that what I was feeling was nothing more than the natural intensity of a wedding day, because emotional events often create physical sensations that can be misinterpreted when you are overwhelmed. I stepped slightly away from the table where I had been standing, still holding the drink but no longer bringing it anywhere near me, and I began to focus on the details of my surroundings with more deliberate attention. The reception area was still filled with movement and conversation, with guests laughing, taking photos, and moving between tables as the evening progressed in a way that appeared completely normal from the outside. That contrast made it harder to trust my own internal signals, but at the same time it made me more aware that I could not dismiss them without at least observing further. I noticed my brother again, Daniel Carter, this time not just near the refreshment area but moving through the space in a way that placed him closer to where drinks were being served than what seemed necessary for casual interaction. I watched him briefly without drawing attention to myself, trying to determine whether his movement had a clear purpose or if I was simply becoming overly cautious due to my own changing physical state. It was difficult to separate perception from suspicion at that point, because the subtle shift I had felt earlier had not disappeared, and instead seemed to remain present in a way that made focusing more difficult than usual. He set the drink down fully this time on a nearby table and placed both hands on the edge of the surface, grounding myself physically while I tried to reassess the situation logically. He asked myself whether anyone else had noticed anything unusual about the drinks or whether I was the only person experiencing this growing sense of imbalance, but there was no external indication that anything was wrong in the environment. That absence of visible confirmation created a second layer of uncertainty, because it forced me to rely entirely on my own internal assessment rather than shared observation. He attempted to continue engaging with guests nearby, responding when spoken to and maintaining normal conversation, but I became increasingly aware that my focus kept returning to my physical condition and to the drink I had now deliberately set aside. At one point I turned slightly and scanned the area again, noticing that Daniel was no longer in the exact position I had seen him before, though I could not immediately determine where he had moved. That absence of fixed positioning made me more alert, not because I had evidence of wrongdoing, but because I was now actively tracking movement patterns in a way I had not been doing earlier in the evening. He remained calm outwardly, but internally I began constructing a timeline of the last several minutes, trying to identify when exactly the shift in my perception had begun and whether it aligned with any specific interaction or moment within the reception. The more I analyzed it, the more I realized that I could not pinpoint a clear external trigger, which only deepened the uncertainty. He decided not to confront anyone yet, because I understood that acting without clarity could create confusion rather than resolution. Instead, I focused on stabilizing myself within the environment, keeping my posture steady and continuing to observe both my surroundings and my own condition with equal attention. At that stage, I was no longer simply participating in my wedding reception. He was monitoring it. As the reception continued around me, I made a conscious effort to stop analyzing every movement and instead focus on stabilizing my immediate condition, because I realized that without internal control, external observation would not lead to any clear conclusion. He had already separated myself slightly from the social flow of the wedding, standing closer to the edge of the reception space rather than in the center where most guests were gathered. From that position I could observe the environment without fully participating in it, which gave me a clearer sense of how inconsistent my internal state felt compared to what was happening around me. The sensation I had noticed earlier had not intensified dramatically, but it had also not disappeared, and that persistence was what made it more concerning than a temporary reaction. He kept my drink untouched on a nearby table, making a deliberate decision not to consume anything further until I understood exactly what was affecting my perception. At the same time, I began to quietly retrace the sequence of events leading up to this moment, starting from the beginning of the reception when everything had felt normal and structured. He remembered the initial transition from ceremony to celebration, the shift into the reception hall, and the first moments of interaction with guests, none of which had indicated any immediate problem. That contrast made the current state more difficult to interpret, because it meant the change had occurred within a relatively short and unidentifiable window of time. I scanned the room again and noticed Daniel Carter once more at a distance, this time engaged in conversation with another guest near the perimeter of the drink service area. His presence there still did not provide direct evidence of anything specific, but I found myself tracking his location more consciously than before, comparing his movements against the moments when my own condition seemed to fluctuate. He did not approach him, and I did not signal any awareness, because I understood that premature confrontation without clarity would only create confusion and potentially obscure whatever was actually happening. Instead, I focused on maintaining a steady posture and regulating my breathing, ensuring that my outward behavior did not reveal the level of internal analysis I was conducting. He also began mentally listing the possible explanations for what I was experiencing, including simple fatigue, emotional overload, or environmental factors that could affect perception during a high-stimulation event like a wedding reception. However, none of those explanations fully accounted for the timing and persistence of the shift I had noticed earlier, which kept bringing my attention back to the possibility that something external had influenced my condition without immediate visibility. Despite that thought, I remained careful not to assign certainty without evidence, because I knew that assumption could distort judgment in situations where clarity was already limited. I moved slightly again within the space, positioning myself closer to a quieter section of the venue where I could observe without interruption. From there, I could still see the main reception area, the drink table, and the general movement of guests, but I was no longer fully immersed in the social environment. This separation allowed me to think more clearly, and I used that clarity to reassess what I should do next rather than react impulsively. I considered whether to inform someone or to wait for further confirmation, but I ultimately decided that the most responsible action at that moment was continued observation combined with careful self-monitoring. As I stood there, I became increasingly aware that the situation was no longer just about discomfort or suspicion. It had become a process of narrowing uncertainty, where each passing minute either confirmed normalcy or revealed further irregularity, and I needed to remain present long enough to distinguish between the two. As I continued to observe the reception from a more isolated position, I became increasingly aware that my focus had shifted from participating in the event to monitoring it as an unfolding situation that required careful internal documentation. The earlier uncertainty I had experienced had not escalated into something visibly dramatic, but it also had not resolved, and that unresolved state was what kept my attention anchored to every subtle change in my perception. I remained standing near the quieter edge of the venue, where ambient noise from conversations and music was still present but less overwhelming than in the central area. From there, I could observe movement patterns more clearly, including the general flow of guests between tables, the bar area, and the refreshment stations. I noticed again that Daniel Carter was intermittently visible within the broader space, though never in a fixed position long enough to draw a direct conclusion from any single moment. Still, I found myself tracking his proximity to the drink area more consciously than before, not because I had confirmed anything, but because I was now aware that timing and location were relevant variables in understanding what had occurred earlier. At the same time, I continued to monitor my own condition carefully, noting that the earlier sensation I had experienced remained present at a low but consistent level. It was no longer fluctuating in a way that suggested immediate escalation, but its persistence meant I could not fully dismiss it as irrelevant. I kept my drink untouched and made the decision to avoid consuming anything further until I had complete clarity, because maintaining control over variables within my immediate environment had become more important than continuing normal participation in the reception. I reviewed the timeline in my mind again, starting from the moment I first held the drink, through the initial subtle shift in perception, and into the present state where observation had replaced engagement. The more I reconstructed the sequence, the more I understood that there was a narrow but significant window where something may have occurred without my direct awareness. However, I also recognized that without confirmation, that remained only a possibility rather than a conclusion, and I was careful not to allow speculation to replace evidence. I shifted my position slightly again, moving closer to a structural column near the edge of the reception space where I could observe both the main gathering and the service area without drawing attention. From that vantage point, I continued to assess the environment, paying attention to patterns of movement rather than isolated actions. Guests continued to interact normally, and nothing about the overall atmosphere suggested an obvious disruption, which made the contrast between external normalcy and internal uncertainty more pronounced. He considered whether I should involve someone from the event staff or speak to a trusted person within the venue, but I decided against immediate escalation, because I did not yet have sufficient clarity to justify that step. Instead, I focused on maintaining stability and allowing additional information to surface naturally through continued observation. As I stood there, I also became more aware of the importance of distinguishing between perception and confirmation, because the environment itself did not currently provide any external validation of what I was experiencing internally. That distinction became central to how I chose to proceed in that moment. Rather than act on uncertainty, I committed to remaining observant until I could either confirm or rule out the concern through consistent evidence. The reception continued around me without interruption, but my experience of it had fundamentally changed, shifting from participation to analysis, and from celebration to careful monitoring of everything within my immediate field of awareness. As the reception continued around me, I became increasingly aware that my role within the event had shifted from participant to observer, and that shift had fundamentally changed how I interpreted every detail unfolding in front of me. I remained positioned near the edge of the reception space, where the noise of conversation and movement was present but not overwhelming, allowing me to maintain a clearer internal focus. The sensation I had experienced earlier had not intensified, but it also had not disappeared, and that persistence kept me in a state of careful monitoring rather than relaxed participation. He continued to observe the drink area intermittently while also tracking my own condition with equal attention, ensuring that neither external movement nor internal perception was ignored. Daniel Carter was still present within the broader environment, occasionally visible as he moved between clusters of guests, but there was still no single moment that provided direct confirmation of any specific action. Even so, I found myself paying closer attention to his proximity to service areas than I had earlier in the evening, because I was now actively mapping spatial relationships within the event as part of my attempt to reconstruct the timeline. He kept my drink untouched and continued to avoid any further consumption, maintaining full control over what I could directly regulate while allowing the rest of the environment to continue without my interference. As I stood near a structural column, I refined my observation strategy by focusing less on isolated individuals and more on patterns of movement, including how often people approached the drink station, how long they stayed, and whether there were any irregular interruptions in the flow of service. From this perspective, the reception still appeared normal, with guests engaging in conversation, laughter, and routine celebration behavior, which made the internal contrast I was experiencing even more difficult to categorize definitively. I reviewed the earlier sequence again in my mind, starting from the moment I first noticed the subtle shift in perception, then tracing forward through each step of observation and repositioning. He considered whether there had been a specific interaction or moment that aligned with the onset of the sensation, but I could not identify any clear external trigger that matched the timing precisely. That absence of a clear correlation forced me to remain cautious in my interpretation, because I understood that uncertainty without evidence could easily lead to incorrect assumptions. At the same time, I also recognized that dismissing the entire sequence without further investigation would be equally irresponsible, given the consistency of what I had been experiencing internally. I adjusted my position slightly once more, moving to maintain a clear line of sight across both the main reception area and the service section, ensuring that I could observe transitions between spaces rather than only static positions. He also became more aware of how important it was to separate emotional interpretation from observable behavior, because the environment itself did not currently provide any explicit indication of disruption. Everything externally remained structured and orderly, which meant that any conclusion would need to be based on careful accumulation of small details rather than any single definitive event. He continued this pattern of observation while maintaining a steady internal state, resisting the impulse to escalate or confront without clarity. At that stage, my focus had narrowed into a controlled form of awareness, where every movement, every interaction, and every shift in my own perception was being evaluated within a structured mental framework. The reception continued around me unchanged, but my understanding of it had shifted entirely into analysis, marking a clear separation between what was happening externally and how I was choosing to process it internally. As I continued to maintain my position near the edge of the reception space, the situation around me remained outwardly unchanged, yet my internal processing had become significantly more structured and deliberate. He was no longer reacting to each individual sensation or visual cue in isolation, but instead evaluating the entire environment as a continuous system of interactions and movement patterns. The earlier uncertainty I had experienced still persisted at a low level, but it had stabilized into a consistent background condition rather than an escalating disturbance. These allowed me to focus more clearly on external observation without being pulled repeatedly into internal fluctuation. I maintained a fixed awareness of the drink area, the guest flow, and the positions of individuals who moved between those points, while also continuing to monitor my own condition at regular intervals. Daniel Carter remained within the broader environment, occasionally visible at different points near the reception layout, though still without any single confirmed action that could be definitively interpreted in isolation. Despite that, I continued to include his movements in my mental reconstruction of the timeline, not as evidence of conclusion, but as variables within a larger pattern I was still trying to understand. I repositioned myself slightly again to maintain a clearer line of sight across the central serving area, ensuring that I could observe both direct activity and peripheral transitions. From this angle, I could see that the reception staff continued their duties without interruption, and guests were still engaging in normal celebratory behavior, which reinforced the importance of distinguishing between environmental normalcy and my internal state. I reviewed the earlier sequence once more, focusing specifically on the transition point between when everything felt normal and when I first noticed the persistent change in perception. I attempted to identify whether there had been any shared interaction, environmental exposure, or specific moment that aligned with that shift, but the reconstruction remained incomplete due to the subtlety of the onset. That lack of a clear trigger made it more important for me to rely on structured observation rather than assumption, because the absence of confirmation could easily lead to incorrect interpretation if I allowed inference to replace evidence. At the same time, I could not ignore the fact that the persistence of the sensation, even at a reduced level, suggested that whatever I was experiencing was not purely transient in nature. He continued to remain still and composed, ensuring that my external behavior did not reflect internal uncertainty, while maintaining a consistent focus on environmental monitoring. I tracked movement patterns across the reception space, noting how guests circulated between tables, how frequently individuals approached the drink area, and whether any irregular behavior patterns emerged within those interactions. Nothing in the external environment indicated disruption or alarm, which made my internal analysis even more dependent on subtle detail recognition rather than overt events. I adjusted my position once more to maintain optimal visibility while minimizing attention drawn to myself, because I understood that observation required both clarity of vision and control of presence. At that stage, the situation had fully transitioned into a structured analytical state, where every element was being evaluated through a methodical framework rather than emotional response. The reception continued without interruption, but my perception of it had fundamentally changed into a continuous process of assessment and verification, where the primary objective was no longer participation, but understanding the precise conditions under which my experience had shifted and whether any external factor could eventually be confirmed as the cause. As I continued observing the reception from my established position near the edge of the venue, the overall structure of the environment remained unchanged, but my internal analysis had become increasingly refined and methodical. I was no longer cycling through uncertainty in a reactive way, but instead maintaining a steady observational state where every detail was being processed within a consistent framework of evaluation. The sensation I had first noticed earlier in the reception was still present, though now stabilized into a background condition rather than an active disruption, allowing me to maintain clearer cognitive separation between perception and interpretation. I kept my attention distributed across three primary zones of focus: the drink service area, the central guest circulation path, and my own physiological state, which I continued to monitor at measured intervals to ensure consistency. Daniel Carter remained intermittently visible within the broader space, though still without any single confirmed action that could be isolated as definitive evidence of involvement in the earlier shift I had experienced. Despite this, I continued to track his movement patterns as part of a larger reconstruction effort, not because I had reached a conclusion, but because his position relative to key areas of interest remained relevant to the timeline I was mentally assembling. He adjusted my stance slightly once again to maintain an unobstructed line of sight across the reception floor, ensuring that I could observe transitions between the drink station and surrounding tables without drawing attention to myself. From this perspective, the reception staff continued their duties in a routine manner, and guests remained engaged in normal celebratory interaction, reinforcing the external appearance of stability. He reviewed the sequence of events once more in my mind, focusing on the narrow interval between the initial moment I held the drink and the onset of the persistent internal change in perception. He attempted to identify any overlapping interactions, environmental exposure points, or specific physical proximity events that might align with that shift, but the reconstruction remained incomplete due to the subtle and gradual nature of the transition. That lack of a clearly identifiable trigger required me to maintain strict separation between inference and confirmation, because I understood that interpretation without evidence could distort the accuracy of the analysis. At the same time, I could not dismiss the persistence of the condition entirely, as its continuity suggested that the cause, whatever it was, had not been resolved or reversed within the timeframe I was currently observing. He remained stationary for a longer interval, allowing myself to fully absorb the ambient patterns of movement around me without interruption, focusing on consistency rather than isolated anomalies. He noted the frequency with which individuals approached the drink area, the duration of their presence there, and the absence of any visible irregularities in staff behavior or guest interaction. Everything externally continued to present as normal, which created a persistent analytical tension between observable reality and internal experience. He refined my observation strategy further by narrowing attention to transitions rather than static positions, because movement between points of interest was more likely to reveal inconsistencies than stationary observation alone. Throughout this process, I maintained strict composure, ensuring that my external behavior remained aligned with the expected social context of the event, even as my internal processing operated at a significantly higher level of scrutiny. The reception continued uninterrupted, but my experience of it had fully transitioned into a structured analytical evaluation, where every element was being continuously assessed within a controlled mental framework designed to isolate cause, sequence, and relevance without allowing assumption to override observation. As the reception moved further into its ongoing rhythm, I remained in my established position near the edge of the venue, continuing the same structured observation approach that had defined the last several minutes of my experience. The environment itself remained outwardly unchanged, with guests still engaged in conversation, movement between tables continuing at a steady pace, and the drink service area operating without visible disruption. However, internally, my analysis had reached a more advanced stage of pattern evaluation, where I was no longer simply tracking individual movements but instead comparing repeated behavioral sequences across time intervals. The persistent sensation I had experienced earlier remained present at a low and stable level, not increasing in intensity, but also not resolving, which maintained my focus on controlled monitoring rather than emotional interpretation. I adjusted my stance slightly to maintain an optimal observational angle across both the central reception area and the service zone, ensuring that I could capture transitions between movement points rather than only static positions. Daniel Carter remained intermittently visible within the broader environment, though still without any singular action that could be definitively isolated as causative or directly linked to the earlier shift in my perception. Despite that, I continued to include his positioning within my broader reconstruction model, because his proximity to key environmental zones remained relevant to the timeline I was building internally. He reviewed the entire sequence again from the moment I first held the drink, through the onset of the subtle internal change, and into the present state of stabilized observation. The more I reconstructed the timeline, the more I recognized that the transition had not occurred as a single identifiable event, but rather as a gradual shift within a narrow window that made precise attribution more difficult. That realization reinforced the need to rely strictly on observable data points rather than inferred connections, because the absence of a clear causal marker increased the risk of incorrect interpretation. He maintained steady composure while continuing to monitor both environmental movement and internal state, ensuring that neither was neglected in the analytical process. At this stage, my focus had shifted almost entirely into a structured evaluation framework, where I was assessing frequency, proximity, and timing of movements within the reception space. He noted how often guests approached the drink station, how long they remained in that area, and whether any deviations from expected behavior patterns occurred, but everything continued to align with normal event flow. This consistency in external behavior created a contrast with my internal condition, which still carried a low-level persistence that had not yet been fully explained or resolved. I refined my observation strategy once more by prioritizing transitional movement paths rather than stationary positions, because movement between zones provided more meaningful data for identifying irregularities than isolated presence alone. Throughout this process, I ensured that my external behavior remained fully consistent with the social expectations of the event, maintaining normal posture, neutral expression, and minimal attention-drawing behavior while continuing. Intensive internal analysis. The reception continued uninterrupted around me, but my experience of it had fully transitioned into a continuous evaluation state, where every observable detail was being processed through a structured framework designed to isolate timing relationships, movement consistency, and potential points of deviation within an otherwise stable environment. As the reception gradually moved toward its later phase, I remained in the same observational position near the edge of the venue, maintaining the structured analytical state I had established earlier. The external environment continued to present itself as stable and uninterrupted, with guests still engaged in conversation, movement between tables continuing at a steady rhythm, and the service area operating without any visible deviation from expected behavior. Internally, however, my focus had reached its most refined stage, where I was no longer tracking isolated details but instead evaluating the entire event as a continuous sequence of correlated movements and temporal patterns. The sensation I had experienced earlier remained present at a consistent low level, neither increasing nor dissipating, which allowed me to maintain cognitive clarity while continuing systematic observation. I adjusted my position slightly to preserve an unobstructed view across both the central reception area and the drink service zone, ensuring that I could monitor transitions between spaces without drawing attention to my presence. Daniel Carter remained intermittently visible within the broader environment, though still without any singular confirmed action that could be definitively isolated as causative or directly linked to the earlier perceptual shift I had experienced. Despite the lack of direct confirmation, I continued to include his movements within my broader analytical reconstruction, because his proximity to key areas of interest remained relevant to the timeline I had been building. I reviewed the full sequence once again, beginning from the moment I first held the drink, through the initial subtle shift in perception, and into the current stabilized observational state. The more I reconstructed the timeline, the more I understood that the transition had not been a discrete event but rather a gradual progression occurring within a narrow but undefined interval, which made precise identification of a single triggering moment inherently difficult. This understanding reinforced my reliance on structured observation rather than inference, because the absence of a clear causal marker meant that assumptions could easily distort interpretation if not carefully controlled. I maintained steady posture and neutral expression while continuing to process environmental input at a high level of detail, ensuring that my external behavior remained consistent with the expected social dynamics of the event. I observed movement patterns across the reception floor, noting the frequency of guest circulation between tables, the repetition of pathways leading to the drink station, and the consistency of staff activity throughout the space. All external indicators continued to align with normal event behavior, which created a persistent analytical contrast with my internal state, where the earlier sensation still remained unresolved but stable. I refined my observation strategy further by focusing on transitional movement rather than static positioning, because movement between defined areas provided more meaningful data for identifying irregularities than stationary presence alone. I also maintained continuous internal tracking of my own condition at measured intervals, ensuring that any change, however minor, would be registered within my structured evaluation framework. At this stage, the reception had fully transitioned into its later phase, with energy gradually stabilizing rather than escalating, yet my perception of it remained distinct from the external experience of other attendees. I continued to maintain full composure, avoiding any outward indication of concern or deviation from expected participation behavior, while internally sustaining a highly controlled analytical state. The environment remained visually unchanged, but my interpretation of it had fully shifted into a continuous monitoring process, where every detail was being evaluated within a structured framework designed to identify timing relationships, movement consistency, and potential deviations across the full span of the event.